here. Okay, there's that. And slideshow. Oh, but that's not working. Give me just a second. I have a new setup here. And hopefully I can share the correct part. Okay. Now, there's my Zoom presentation. Here we go. And are you seeing my notes or my?
Yeah.
Or my okay, perfect.
That's great.
Okay, great. Okay, so as I was saying, Drylands Agroecology Research is a nonprofit organization headquartered in Longmont, and we use regenerative design as an approach to regenerative agriculture and cultural pollination and research. And I'll explain what I mean by all those things as I go through. So our vision is the transformation of dry, degraded landscapes into lush ecosystems where humans, nature, and spirit thrive. And our mission within that vision is to restore the earth and our communities through regenerative design. So why are we focused on drylands? Well, 40% of all land on Earth is drylands. 25% of humanity lives in dryland ecosystems, and 75% of the Earth's land is already degraded and degrading. So as lands degrade and lose their capacity to hold water, they lose their capacity to sustain life, including human life. And in arid and semi-arid climates, water is the limiting factor for how much carbon our landscapes can sequester, biodiversity they can support, and food they can produce. So what do I mean by drylands? I mean unirrigated areas with low precipitation. And by degraded, I'm talking about lands which are compacted, destroyed through unhealthy agricultural practices, or desertifying for more subtle reasons. As you probably know, desertification is on the rise globally. And what's interesting about this region that we live in here, or that we're operating in particular, is that we're sort of at the edge of the prairie, right? And the prairie health and grassland health and the health of what are now drylands around the world long depended on the presence of large herds of animals moving across, grazing that land, defecating on that land, and migrating back and forth on an annual basis. And so part of what has happened to this land is the removal of those animals. Part of what has happened to it is it being parceled up and fenced off so that animals can't move through. And then there are ag practices and development practices which are pretty destructive. So as we lose topsoil, we emit carbon, we lose the ability of landscapes to generate vegetation. And the human role in this includes overgrazing, bad topsoil management. But we believe that we can reverse desertification and restore these lands through agricultural practices. And I think I want to dispel the sense that humans are necessarily a negative impact on the earth. I think a lot of the sustainability movement has focused on minimizing human impact, and we want to kind of change the narrative around that and say that human impact can be positive. So let's look at our pilot project, Elk Run Farm. So our founders here in the picture, Nick and Marissa, acquired Elk Run Farm almost 8 years ago. And the idea was to start a farm, not a nonprofit organization. So not having a lot of experience, Nick acquired this land and went to the various agencies to get advice on how best to farm it, and was uniformly told that it simply wasn't farmable. Just sell it move on, get out of here, don't do it. And he didn't accept that. He didn't accept that. And leaning in on his training as a permaculture designer and seeking out other designers who specialized in drylands, began what has now been an almost 8-year experiment in restoring this piece of land. And you can see in this photograph here that it's pretty verdant. It didn't look like this when we acquired it. So the first thing we do is reshape the land, right, through earthworks. These earthworks are designed to give the water, which would be quickly running off of this compacted land, the opportunity to sink into the land. So all our work is grounded in the understanding that in this climate, water is the limiting factor for how much carbon our landscapes can sequester, biodiversity they can support, and food they can produce. So by starting with water harvesting earthworks to passively rehydrate the landscape, we create the opportunity for this to happen. Here's an aerial view of an adjacent farm, which we have a development project going on. This is Metacarbon Farm, and this is the first 10-acre development that we have on there. And what you're looking at here are what we call contour swales. So a contour swale is effectively a trench dug along contour. So they're perfectly horizontal. And if you notice that they curve around a little bit, it's because we're literally using a laser level to define the absolute horizontal line and then cutting the swales along those lines. Now, what happens in this Colorado soil is that in addition to being compacted and very dry, it tends to have very low organic content. So what we add in there is a lot of organic matter in the form of tree clippings. We work with a lot of arborists in the area, and when they run their branches through the chipper, we get all the wood chips. Compost, and very importantly, is the addition of fungal mycelia, which really enhance the growth of the trees. And then you can see in this photograph here, I don't know if it's visible to you, and I can't see your faces, so I feel like I'm talking to myself here. But you see all these little vertical white hash marks? If somebody wants to say yes.
Yes, yeah. We can see them.
Okay,
in the
so is my cursor visible on the screen?
Yes.
Oh, it is. Okay, yeah. So these little hash marks, these are trees. So what we've done here is dug the swale, and on the downhill side of the swale, where there's a little bit of a berm, we plant the trees. So the trees are adjacent to all the organic matter that we've planted. The slope here slopes downward from the right side of the screen to the left. So when it precipitates, when it rains or snows, the water flows into these swales and soaks into the ground, and is really, the absorption is helped a lot by the addition of this organic matter. And so what we're creating here basically is we're accelerating an ecological succession process towards the state of a savanna. So we're going from a grassland, from usually a degraded grassland, to a savanna. And a savanna in this case we're defining as one that has about 25% tree coverage to 75% grassland. And one of the reasons the savanna is really helpful is that it's one of the optimum ratios to maximize the conversion of solar energy, basically, into biomass. And this kind of mix of sun and shade also creates a great opportunity for us to graze livestock in these rows in a rotational grazing pattern, which effectively mimics what would have been the ancestral pattern of animals moving through this, and greatly enriches the fertility of the soil. So one of the criticisms, or maybe one of the barriers to entry in regenerative agriculture for a lot of practitioners, is that you're often looking at a 5 to 7 year window before you start to get a yield. We've planted, I'm not sure, I think it's around 800 trees in this particular one. I don't remember the exact number, but a large number of trees, which will be fruitful and productive in 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. But how does the farmer make money in the interim? Well, our answer to that is you can graze your livestock in these spaces. So in this case, and in the case of a lot of our clients, they had a piece of unproductive land here that wasn't flat enough, it's not irrigated, and therefore not really farmable in a conventional sense. And this allows them to access this land and use it productively for themselves. So over the last 7 years, we've planted over 5,000 trees. This year, we have 6,000 trees that are going in just in the month of April. Many of these trees, including most of the ones that are going to go in this month, are unirrigated. So the moisture in these swales makes it possible to establish trees with no irrigation. At Elk Run Farm, we have 1,000 trees with an 85% survival rate, which is really good. That's comparable to the survival rate you get when you plant trees in irrigated settings. So what we have here is a mix of productive fruit trees like apples, pears, and plums, as well as nitrogen-fixing nurse trees to increase the fertility for those productive trees. And eventually, as these trees grow, it will create a cool, shady, moist microclimate that supports further moisture retention. As there is more moisture, there's more vegetation, which improves the soil and helps it retain more moisture. So what we're creating here is a virtual cycle of cumulative hydration. So this type of farming, of integrating trees into pastures and croplands, is called agroforestry. And basically, with this approach, if we walked away from this system and did nothing, it would continue to flourish. So what we're talking about here is multi-hundred-year landscapes. Here's a short list of some of the trees that we've got. So apples, pears, plums, apricots, hazelnuts, currants, mulberries, elderberries, Nanking cherry, those last ones being shrubs rather than trees. And then the nitrogen fixers are the Siberian pea shrub, the false indigo, and the honey locust.
I have a quick question for you.
Yeah.
Why do you plant honey locust trees? I've dealt with them invasively in Texas on agricultural restoration before, and I'm curious.
Well, that's a great question. One, it's a nitrogen fixer. So most plants will draw nitrogen out of the soil, and it's a major nutrient for the majority of plants. But these three at the bottom, the pea shrub, the indigo, and the locust, actually put nitrogen into the soil. So we refer to them as nurse plants because they're supportive to the other plants in this polyculture that we're creating.
Interesting. Okay, I did not know that. Thank you.
Yeah. And then the seed pods of the honey locust can be fodder for some animals, right? I'm not sure how cows feel about them, but I'm pretty sure that the goats and the sheep like them. And we can certainly collect them and feed them to our pigs. They'll eat anything.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned earlier, we do holistic grazing that helps regenerate the grasslands. And you can see how lush the grass is in this shot here, where we keep our sheep at Elk Run Farm. We do manage these intensively. So the goal here is prevent overgrazing, maximize fertility. So these healthy grasslands, particularly if you graze them again late in the season, support climate resilience. They provide livelihood for people in the form of livestock production. They are deeply resistant to drought as compared to ungrazed lands. They help anchor soils in place, and they really support a rich soil microbiome that helps retain moisture. Interesting factoid here, grasslands store 150% more carbon than trees do underground. And when the land burns, these perennial grasses will come back. So that carbon, except what burns off on the surface, remains sequestered. Here's another example of how we use livestock. So when we first arrived at Elk Run Farm, there was a large compacted gravel parking lot where the previous owners had been planting heavy equipment, tractors, trucks, excavators, that sort of thing. So if you look at the person's right hand here, in other words, the one that's on the left side of your screen, that's what the soil looked like in this particular piece of land. And what we did then and have continued to do at plots all around the region is fence our pigs in there and feed the pigs all sorts of compost waste. And now we have partnerships with breweries and distilleries in the area where they give us our used grain. We feed that to the pigs. And within a year or so, you have what is in her left hand, this rich black topsoil. You can then rotate the pigs out and use this for your annual garden beds or growing whatever you want to grow. In this particular case, what we're growing in here is sort of our climate adapted crops. And here's some corn. And what's really interesting about this is we've been breeding this strain of corn, which was an indigenous strain of corn, which we received from some elders from the local indigenous community. And we've been selectively breeding this. In other words, at the end of every year, we retain the healthiest seeds. And we plant these in this plot and in other plots in the area, along with amaranth and other grains that are well adapted to the region. And we only irrigate them through June, just to establish them. And we don't harvest until October, but this is what they look like. So quite healthy. And this is a testament to both the selective breeding of these crops and also the richness of the soil, thanks to this intensive animal management. So basically, our holistic approach here to our land management consists of one, water management. Slow it, spread it, sink it into the ground, make sure the ground has enough organic matter to retain that moisture. Dryland agroforestry, holistic livestock management, and perennial and bioregional crop breeding. These are the cornerstones of our agroforestry program. So what we're talking about here is really creating ecosystems. These are effectively analogs to natural ecosystems. There's a certain amount of artifice to it. This is our first site at the Yellow Barn Farm, also known as the Allen's Farm. So the Elk Run Farm is 14 acres, and that's our main research and development site. We are now fully partnered with the Yellow Barn Farm, which is 100 acres. And at this point, we have 65 acres under development, approximately. And much of it is using the swale system, as you see here, although some of it is also planted as annual beds, but using either traditional indigenous techniques in collaboration with various indigenous-led organizations in the area, or sort of more what you might call Western, but regenerative farming practices. Let's see, what am I forgetting? So again, the foundation here is passive water harvesting, shifting from annual cropping to perennial cropping systems. So we don't have to till every year. So we don't risk that topsoil loss. And I think this raises a question of why farming versus pure ecological restoration. And I think that in conservation circles, going back to what I said earlier about the narrative that humans are always a net negative, right? And so there's this idea of conservation is not touching the land, leaving it undisturbed. But here we are, and we're working on lands that are already disturbed. And in many cases, these are lands that are brittle and if left alone would not actually recover, but would continue to degrade because they're lacking certain key elements of their traditional ecosystem, which in this case would have been herds of bison and elk and deer and antelope and things like that, right? So we believe that by creating this kind of ecosystem, which is biologically, ecologically rich and self-regenerating, but also supportive to human needs, we can change the story of our relationship to the land and create healthy biodiverse ecosystems that are also supportive to human needs, rather than the only alternative being destructive farming or non-interventionist conservation. So how do we prove that this is working? Well, we have our research program. And basically, our research program explores how effectively our landscapes retain moisture, sequester carbon, support biodiversity. I like to refer to it rather as ecological outcome verification. In other words, we are studying what the ecological outcomes of our work are. It also helps us tell the story of what's actually happening and adjust our methodologies when we're not getting the results that we're hoping for. So here's what we study. And I'm not going to read this whole list, but in broad strokes, you can see we're looking at soil health. We're looking at grassland biodiversity with an emphasis on restoring the abundance and health of native species in the area. We're looking at insect biodiversity, and we are looking then at the trees and shrubs that we ourselves are planting, but really tracking the survival rate and the growth rate. And again, I just want to emphasize that most of these are unirrigated or very sparsely irrigated, which is so incredibly important in our bioregion. So what have we seen so far? A 630% increase in soil organic matter in our pastures on average, compared to adjacent properties where nothing has been touched. And in our grain fields, where that black rich soil was, we're looking at 960% increase in soil organic matter. We're looking at a 1,400% increase in soil nitrogen, a 76% tree survival rate across all our sites over the last 3 years. We did slightly better at Elk Run Farm, but as we've kind of increased the intensity of our interventions, we seem to have lost a little bit. So that's something for us to look into. And an 1,100% increase in beneficial insect populations. And specifically, we're looking at pollinators and predators, spiders, that sort of thing. The predators in particular, because they're a good indicator that other species are in the area. So what's possible in Boulder County? Well, we are thinking that in the next 7 years, we're going to dig 50,000 linear feet of contour swales to passively rehydrate around 1,000 acres of land. We plan to plant 75,000 trees, and that will sequester 1,750 tons of carbon annually. And we're looking at creating 1,000 acres of habitat that's going to support a greater diversity of pollinators and other wildlife. One of the keys to our growth is land partnerships. And I want to emphasize the Yellow Barn Farm is this one I mentioned earlier. And that's been really great relationship for us, having that 100 acres. And we are deeply, deeply embedded in their processes. But we also have partnerships with Metacarbon Farm, 49th Street Farm, and various other farms in the area. And a lot of inquiries from other sites in a much larger area in southern Colorado for sure, but also New Mexico, Arizona, the Wind Rivers, Shoshone Reservation in Wyoming. We're already working there. We're talking to the Dene Reservation and Hopi reservations in New Mexico and Arizona as well. Here's probably a map that I'm imagining is kind of illegible on your screens right now, but this is our master plan for the Yellow Barn Farm. And so this area, earlier I showed you a picture, that was just this little area right here, right? So we've got this silvopasture, we've got just this hayfield up here, we've got about 60 more acres that we're planting over the next couple of weeks up in here, if anyone wants to come out for a tree planting. And then next year, I think we'll be building out this orchard down here. And then we have our annual garden beds in this area. So it's a lovely site. And Yellow Barn itself has a wealth of different kinds of social programming and events, everything from yoga classes to tree plantings to seminars. And it's just wonderful to be partnered with them. So when we talk about regenerative design, though, we're not just talking about how plants and soil relate to each other. We're also talking about economic and social systems and how they're all connected. This work we do has to be meaningful to people It has to change the relationship between agriculture and nutrition and health and people's personal economics and the economy at large. We're moving away from extractive models into models that are reciprocal, but we can't just work the land without changing our relationship to the land and to each other. And this is core to what we're doing. So as I said, we're community driven. And we have two other major program areas besides what we call our land stewardship. We have our cultural advocacy program, which is really about getting people out on the land and beginning to level out a lot of the food insecurity issues in our local region, Boulder County. About 17% of the population of Boulder County experiences food insecurity regularly. And so we're creating opportunities for people to come on the land, engage with the land, grow food, learn about how food is grown, learn about how to prepare these different crops, which are native to this area, and also leave with food. And we have CSAs, which are not your typical CSAs. It's not really a CSA in the sense of normally somebody subscribes and you get your box of food every week. Our CSAs are in partnership with indigenous-led organizations and other communities in the area where the food that is grown in these gardens is just distributed to the elders in those communities free of charge. And
sorry, can you tell me what CSA stands for?
Oh, community supported agriculture.
Thank you.
Basically, traditionally, it's a membership model so that you can be a member of a small farm, support that farm by paying upfront for the season, and then you get what you get every week as the season progresses, right? Mm. The other thing that we talk a lot about, and we do a lot about, is education. I talked about culture change, about creating reciprocal relationships, about reframing the way we think about our relationship to the land and the economics around agriculture. So we have training programs for adults, we have workshops, we have seminars, and we run programs for youth, a lot of programs for youth, and growing. And so at both of our sites, at both Elk Run Farm and at the Yellow Barn Farm, we have basically what amounts to forest schools. If you're familiar with forest schools, that's an educational model where the kids are basically outdoors interacting with nature all day and in an experiential learning setting. So in this picture here is the director of our what we call Folk Farm, our youth education program. And over here, we have Andrea Nawaj. She's the executive director of Harvest of All First Nations, and her child there working on our indigenous foods garden at the Yellow Barn Farm. So what we have grown into over the last 7 years is a Center for Education and Training, a focal point for Boulder County to engage in what regenerative agriculture can mean for this community. We're spinning out all sorts of regenerative business models. There are lots of private for-profit enterprises existing alongside and within the umbrella of Drylands Agroecology. We are an incubator for generating a bioregional seed and agroforestry stock that is climate adapted to this area, and partnership with indigenous communities, which have traditionally been marginalized and removed from the land, particularly in this area. So we talk about relational scaling. We get a lot of pressure from our funders to scale, you need to be bigger, you need to scale. That's really difficult to do just by getting bigger. We do it through relationships, through sharing our knowledge and experience, and through providing and supporting opportunities to replicate what we do in other places. So you can find out more and get involved if you want at dar.eco. And I want to copy this, but it's not letting me. So I will paste that link into the chat. And highlights are what are coming up. If you go to the website, you can look at our last year's annual report that just came out. It's got a lot of information about what we've been up to and how we're growing and what we're prioritizing. On April 15th, that weekend, we're having a tree planting up at the Yellow Barn Farm. On April 22nd, we're having a fundraiser and a tree planting. And throughout the season, we have a citizen science days where you can come out and learn about our soil testing approach, how we study insect biodiversity, and go out, get trained, go out in the field and collect data. And it's a lot of fun. So I encourage people to do that. Thank you.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you so much, James.
Yeah.
That was amazing.